In this video, we're going to talk about notation and why it matters. Most importantly, notation communicates understanding. Therefore, a lack of notation or the incorrect notation communicates a misunderstanding, right? And so if math teachers believe that you don't understand, then we're probably going to take off some small amount of points, right? And students sometimes get frustrated by that, but that's the reason we do that, is because we're not 100% sold that you know what you're talking about. So let's just talk about a couple of quick pieces to drive home. So the major point of business here is the difference between naming a construction versus the measure of said construction. So take, for instance, this idea of a segment. Let's talk about the segment right here between Q and P. Capital Q, capital P, or capital P, capital Q, with a little segment bar above it. Now, even though you can't see it in the picture, there's also this ray that starts at Q and goes through P, right? Ray QP. Now remember, rays, the first letter always has to be the starting point or the end point, and then any letter in which it goes through with a single arrow on the right, always on the right. The right arrow doesn't dictate that the arrow goes to the right, it just dictates, or the ray goes to the right, it just dictates that it's a ray. Now up here, there are rays, lines, segment. So segment, UY, is this piece right here. And now the whole thing, and by whole thing I mean the entire line, would be line UY. So just the differences of, ray UY, and let's make that in red, right? So I'm going to retrace that in red. Ray UY starts at U, go towards Y. Line UY goes in both directions forever, and segment UY is just the points contained between endpoints U and Y. That is just the name. Now, out of those constructions, which is the only one that I can actually measure? Segment UY. That's it. And if I want to measure that, and let's just say that this is 5 centimeters, then I would say UY equals 5 centimeters. And when I see two capital letters like that with no notation above them, that stands for the measure of segment UY. The measure of, or the length of, segment UY. Critical. Now we move on to angles. So here's angle MPN. Also could be called angle NPM. I can't just call it P because that's too ambiguous. There's several angles at that vertex P. This particular notation with the M in front of it denotes that I'm talking about some sort of measurement. So the minute I see M of angle MPN, I say, oh, that's the measure of angle MPN. I'm looking for a number and the notation in degrees because that's how we measure angles. Next, just to retouch on arcs, the minute I see a two-lettered arc, it's automatically a minor arc. Starts at Q, ends at R. When I see three letters, it ends at Q and N. So Q is an endpoint, N is an endpoint. When I look at those endpoints, they create a diameter, which automatically makes this a semicircle, right? Half of a circle. And then for QRM, starts at Q, ends at M, goes through R to get there. Oh, so that's a major arc. Again, for any of these, if I were to place an M in the front of any of these, I am now talking about something with a value in degrees, right? So all of these now have become the measure of, and I would put degrees as the units. Next, we have the secant versus tangent discussion, right? So the first question is from Q to N, what is that? Could that be a secant? Well, it could be, right? QN, segment QN is part of a line. So I could say, well, line QN is a secant. I think the most obvious secant in this picture is up here, line UY, and students will gravitate towards that because they see the line notation. But again, any segment is part of a line, right? That's how a segment exists. The line exists, therefore a portion of it can exist. Now, could line PN be a secant? Yeah, if you would extend it, it would travel and hit the circle twice. What do I specifically call segment PN? I would call that a radius. It is a segment whose endpoint goes from the center of the circle to a point on the circle. Any segment that goes from the center on would be a radius. Then you have this idea of a diameter. What is a diameter? A chord that passes through the center. And what's a chord? A segment that has its endpoints on the circle. Who else is a chord? QR. But that is not a diameter because it doesn't pass through the center. And lastly, tangents. I think the most obvious tangent is line ST, but line LQ is also a tangent. It looks like it's only going to touch at one moment at Q. Lastly, you have yourselves a central angle here. It's a central angle because the vertex is at the center of the circle versus an inscribed angle. This is an inscribed angle because the vertex is on the circle. And I think that about covers all of it. Again, we would name those using 3 letters, and if we wanted to talk about their measures, we would put an M in front. So just keep in mind that anytime you see an M, it means measure of, it means we're looking for a numerical value. Otherwise, we're just naming things. Notation matters. Communicate your understanding clearly. Thanks for listening.